Welcome to the New Books Network.
My name is Maria Lipman. I'm the editor of Russia Post, a website published by the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. I also write capsule reviews of Russia-related books for the Foreign Affairs. It is my pleasure to talk to Serhiy Kudelia about his new book, Seize the City, Undo the State, The Inception of Russia's War on Ukraine, published by Oxford University Press in February 2025. Serhiy Kudelia is Associate Professor of Political Science at Baylor University. Hi, Serhiy. Thank you for agreeing to talk to me today.
Hi, Maria. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, to begin with, maybe say a few words about yourself and your research and how your book stands apart, and I think it does stand apart from other accounts of this war from numerous books which have been published since the war began 3 years ago.
Right. So the book itself is not about 2022. It's about the beginning of the covert invasion of Russia in 2014 in Donbass. And I've started my research on this topic, I think, at the time when this invasion began and the conflict began itself in Donbass, so around 2014. But most of my field research in the region for this book has been done prior to the full-scale invasion, a few years prior to it, so between 2018 and 2020. And the way in which my book differs from everything that has been published so far is that it seeks to look at the developments in individual towns and trace the outbreak of the armed conflict by comparing the mechanisms through which these individual towns have been seized by the militants and ultimately governed by the separatist authorities. So most of the articles and most of the books on the outbreak of the armed conflict in Donbass, they look at macro-level variables, so macro-level factors. They look at the role of Russia, they look at the role of the state, capacity of Ukraine, they look at the role of economic factors, etc. Instead of looking at these large variables, I was interested in seeing the variation on the ground in the way the armed conflict began. And part of my research was to visit each individual town and collect data from people who live there, from the journalists, from civic activists, from local officials, and it was still about 5 years after the conflict, so the memories were still fresh, who still could remember many of their impressions, many of their reactions to the events on the ground. And by combining a variety of different other sources, I managed to reconstruct the timelines and the chronology of the events in about 20 towns across Donbass. I visited only government-controlled areas, and that ultimately resulted in that book that we can all now read.
Okay, but I think it would probably make sense to briefly remind our listeners about the dramatic events that immediately preceded the period you are looking at in your book, and specifically, of course, how those events were perceived in Donbass compared to other regions in Ukraine in terms of the civic and regional identity that you're looking at, and indeed how differently they were perceived, those developments.
Right. So the focus of my book is on about 6 months at the very beginning of the conflict itself. So starting from February of 2014 up until July of 2014. But of course, the key precondition for the conflict, the events that immediately preceded the outbreak of the conflict, was the revolution in Kiev, and then the protests, large-scale protests in other towns of western and central Ukraine. And I'm showing in my book how these events, the events associated with the Euromaidan revolution, how significant they were in shaping the perceptions and preferences of locals, especially in Donbass. And so, of course, without looking at Euromaidan revolution and without looking at the effects of the Euromaidan revolution on people in Donbass living in this region, it's impossible to understand why the conflict began. But addressing your other question, how Donbass was different from other regions, it was different in a number of ways. So, of course, you had a particular, very specific regional identity in Donbass that emerged over many decades. It was not a phenomenon associated with contemporary Ukraine. And that was shaped by a variety of different economic, political, cultural developments in the region. Some of them were associated with the large-scale industrialization that began in Donbass around the time of the 1920s and 30s and continued all the way through the 60s and 70s. That industrialization ultimately led to in-migration into the region of multiple ethnicities, ethnic groups. And so Donbass, basically this large region of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, became what some scholars call a melting pot of different ethnicities that did not really pay too much attention to ethnic identities, but develop a very peculiar regional identity associated with their pride for the region and with their rootedness in that particular region. There is nothing unusual about regional identities, and many parts of Ukraine have different regional identities, including the part that I come from in Western Ukraine. But what was special about Donbass was that regional identity in Donbass conflicted for a long time with national identity. And so if, for example, Western Ukrainians see themselves as a specific region with its own history that is complementary to the Ukrainian national identity, the Donbass regional identity became contradictory or conflicting with the overall Ukrainian national identity, and that presented both a problem from the standpoint of nation building, but it also presented an opportunity for local political elites. And as I show in my book, at the beginning of my book, I explained that in order for us to understand the events of 2014, we also have to understand that they came on the heels at the end of a long political polarization process that was driven by national elites. Many of them came from Donbass, who used this regional identity in order to build up their political machine, party of regions, and then mobilize people in Donbass during electoral phases or cycles in order to win elections and ultimately gain power. And a lot of these polarizing appeals and messages of local elites were explicitly anti-Kiev. They were questioning Ukrainian authorities, Ukrainian government, because at that time, for some time, Party of Regions was in opposition. And they were also criticizing the nation-building policies that were adopted both by Kuchma, by the way, but also especially by Viktor Yushchenko, the president who became the Ukrainian president who was one of the leaders of the Orange Revolution. And as I demonstrate, Euromaidan revolution in Donbass was viewed through the prism by many of the Orange Revolution. It was viewed as a sort of remake of the Orange Revolution, an attempt to, in a way, steal the victory of the local elites, Viktor Yanukovych, and basically come to power through illegal means, through the means of the coup. So it was by many viewed as a coup organized by the West. There was a geopolitical dimension to it. And hence, if the Orange Revolution was resolved ultimately peacefully because elites made a consensus agreement, they signed an agreement, they agreed on the constitutional changes. After the Euromaidan revolution, there was no elite agreement. Elites fled, right? So many of the regional elites from Donbass, they fled to Russia. And as a result, there became a vacuum that was filled with a variety of different actors. As I explain in my book, certainly Russian actors played a very significant role. But it's also completely wrong to underestimate the significance of the local actors who also filled in this vacuum and also made their choices, had their own strategies, and had their own goals. And so a lot of my book explains with specific examples, looking at individual actors, how they build their strategies and how they engaged in activism in 2014.
Right. So if the Euromaidan revolution, as you're saying, was seen in Donbass as a remake of sorts of the Orange Revolution, yet with no consensus. And I will quote from your book, The Revolution of Dignity, or the Euromaidan Revolution, left behind a weakened state, a polarized society, and a government with dubious legitimacy. From this perspective, and based on what you said about Euromaidan being seen as something Western organized in Donbass, what was the view of people in Donbass of the Russian military intervention and the annexation of Crimea? I don't mean the large-scale military intervention, but the early military intervention and annexation of Crimea. What was the response of the local people to those developments?
Right. So, of course, it's also important to mention that there was a great variation in the way people in Donbass viewed both Russian intervention in Crimea and later separatist governance in Donbass. And this is also one of the insights of my book, that many towns, regions, many areas in Donbass localities responded very differently to these events. And even some people who were initially favorable of Yanukovych were ultimately opposed to the separatist takeover. So that's an important caveat that I wanted to make clear. But in general, I think many people in Donbass and many of the polls demonstrate that viewed the events in Crimea through the same lens or in the lens or in a way that is very similar to how the Russian propaganda was trying to justify its intervention. And that is an attempt to protect the Russian-speaking population, the ethnic Russians who live in Crimea, from the Western Ukrainian nationalists. Many of the surveys that have been done in February of 2014 and then in March demonstrate that the level of fear and anxieties that were in Donbass associated with the possible incursion of militia groups, nationalist militia groups into this region was very high. And it was higher than in other regions of Ukraine. And so the Russian intervention was viewed through this lens of an outside force that comes in to protect the residents of this region from this potential possible nationalist threat. And as I was watching many of the rallies that were filmed, they're available on YouTube. They were filmed by local bloggers. You could certainly see a sense of euphoria during these rallies among locals who were participating in the rallies. I remember I was watching one of these rallies in the town of Liman in Donetsk Oblast, where the mayor of this town was trying to appeal to the local residents and caution them that if they continue protesting, things like in Crimea may happen in Donbass. But his words actually had the opposite effect. So instead of actually cautioning the locals, they enthusiastically started to shout, "Russia, Russia, Россия, Россия." And that led this mayor to sort of call on them. Where is your patriotism? Where is your civic consciousness? What are you doing? Why are you inviting the aggressor into Donbass? So I think many of the local elites and officials were caught unawares. They were surprised by the response of the locals and the extent of their euphoric attitudes about something that should have been viewed obviously as an aggression against their own state, an attempt to dismantle your state. And so I think this is not obviously an overwhelming response of all the people who live in Donbass, but many of those who were active, who were participating in the rallies, viewed this through the positive frame. And of course, the success of the Russian annexation of Crimea, in the sense that it's Russia's ability to quickly establish control over this region without any significant violent altercations or major violence, that certainly sent a signal to the locals in Donbass that similar events could be possible in their region, and that encouraged sort of inspired many of the local activists to go out and seek actively ask for support from the Russians who were in Crimea, and invite them basically to do the same in Donbass.
Interesting. So you already mentioned that the response varied, and the example of Liman shows that sometimes the official, the administrator in the region, express a different response from his own residents. This logically takes us to this to what you describe in your book as your micro level approach to your research. Now, who are the actors you are looking at in your book, in your research? What does this micro level approach mean? And what are the advantages of this approach from your perspective?
So the micro level approach is a new methodology that has been introduced in the study of armed conflicts about 10, 15 years ago by a number of political scientists, most prominently Stathis Kalovas, who wrote the book, The Logic of Civil Wars. And the micro level approach basically suggests that the focus on macro variables, on large variables like the political regime, state capacity, economics, etc., this misses a very important causal mechanisms that may generate violence on the ground, and that many people who are engaged in violence or who participate or join the armed conflict, they may be doing it for other reasons that are not associated with these large variables. And so the micro level approach is an attempt to retrace these actions of these individual actors and understand them more closely by finding the variation in the level, the intensity of the conflict, or the level of control of the separatists or the insurgents of various parts of the country. And specifically in my book, the micro-level approach allows to identify the significance of social networks in mobilizing separatists for initially protests and then insurgency. And second, the role of community structures. And I think community structures are also important because by looking at individual towns, we see a great variation in the way these towns responded. And a lot of it has to do with the community structure. To what extent community structure is more more industrial based, there is large factories in the city, or it's more agricultural based, for example. The agency that I'm looking at are primarily local officials. They are civic activists. They are political entrepreneurs or members of political parties who were very active in these particular towns. I also look at the role of entrepreneurs, businessmen. I look at the role of journalists, teachers in schools, etc. So a variety of different actors who played some role in this conflict, they all come into my focus, but a consistent story that I show is the extent to which local officials mattered to a greater or lesser degree in how this conflict transpired.
Right. You discuss and you describe in your book many private individuals, just like you just said, local officials, civic activists, political and entrepreneurs, businessmen. How difficult was it for you to actually approach those people and ask them about their backgrounds, their motives, their what they experienced during those first months after 2014? Um, which takes us to your immediate effort as a researcher in Donbass. Would you please speak about that?
Right. So many of these individuals, of course, were not, most of them, I would say, were not known nationally in Ukraine. I learned about them as I was doing my research, even though I studied Ukrainian politics for many years. This was one of the insights of my research, is that when I was entering each individual town and was trying to understand political structure of this town and who were the major players locally, I realized how much life and how much different like political struggles and competitions and intrigues I
May I
had.
please interrupt you for a second? So you're talking about towns. How many towns were there? I mean, of those that you visited where you worked. And I think in your book, you also said that there is a specificity to Donbass in its urban structure. Maybe mention that too as you describe how you approached individuals in those places.
Right. So I think I looked at least, I visited at least 20 towns in Donbass region, and I tried to understand political system or political relationships between different actors in each of these towns. And of course, in some towns, it was more difficult to approach local officials than in others, because as I demonstrated in my book, many of the local officials collaborated directly with the separatists. And so when I could not interview directly the mayors or the deputy mayors, I would have ultimately to rely on members of the city councils, members of their political parties, who know something about their motives of these local mayors and could confirm or deny some of the rumors that I heard from a variety of different sources. So it required a lot of double checking of information because some of the local officials were not available. But I would say that civic activists, party activists, businessmen, entrepreneurs were largely accessible. It was a little more difficult to establish contact with people who supported the Russian side, primarily because locally many of them were still fearful that they would be persecuted, and they certainly might have had suspicions about me as a researcher and why I'm collecting this information. But what I found was that many those who fled to Russia, those separatist supporters who fled to Russia, were in 2018-19 quite open to interviews, and I interviewed many for hours, and they would agree to talk to me for a very long time with a lot of specifics. And I felt that many of them, and we did interview via Zoom, many of them were actually, by that time, willing to share their story, willing to explain their motives and explain their goals, because they felt that a lot of their role was misrepresented, that in Ukraine there was a tendency to present them just as Russian puppets who were doing the Russian bidding, even though they felt that they were acting on their own behalf. And in Russia, there was just a tendency to forget about their role, to forget them, overlook them altogether. So in this sense, this period prior to the full-scale invasion, immediately prior to the full-scale invasion, was, I think, the right period to approach these people and to talk to them. And I got a lot of information from them that I ultimately present in my book. But to the question about urban agglomerations, yes, this is one of the main, I think, arguments, original arguments or contributions of this book, is that it demonstrates that the urban structure of the region of Donbass actually enabled a very small number of militants, because initially at the beginning of the conflict, you really could talk about a few hundred people who were operating in these different towns. That number increased to several thousand by May and June. But initially, we are talking about just several hundred militants. And the urban structure, specifically the proximity of towns to each other, the density of urban agglomeration of Donbass, enabled these few militants to move around and project power, project coercive power and influence on local officials across a variety of different towns. Now, this, of course, would not have been possible without a significant, at least, acceptance of their presence by the local population, not to mention direct involvement and direct support, but certainly passive acceptance. But at the same time, this urban structure, something that sets Donbass apart from other regions, was one of the enabling factors that contributed to this quick acceleration of the conflict into a large-scale war. And I explained that this is one way in which it might have been not something that was planned from the very beginning, was not part of the strategy, but it's certainly the way in which Girkin, the Russian agent who first captured Sloviansk, and a few others, the way in which they operated in Sloviansk, demonstrated a good understanding of this factor, of the factor that you have this large towns or mid-sized towns closely connected to each other, and that enabled them to basically move around Donbass very quickly and establish their presence through local militants, and then control these towns indirectly by having their base in Slavyansk, but ultimately giving orders to their militants in different other towns.
Yeah, we will get to the Russian agent a little later in our conversation. I would like you to focus on the dynamic because you mentioned already the developments in May, June, and you started looking at the period early on in spring. Apparently, August was a turning point, a very significant turning point in the developments in Donbass. Would you please briefly describe the stages? How do you see the dynamic from early spring until August or July?
Right. So I would say there are three main stages or phases. So one phase is overlaps with the victory of Euromaidan revolution at the end of February, which generates its own counter mobilization in many towns of Donbass, counter rallies against Euromaidan revolution, and a lot of that is basically locally generated by the local activists who are unhappy with the result of the Euromaidan revolution. You also have a parallel development that is the formation of the self-defense groups, many of which were organized by local elites, by local mayors. And these self-defense groups were meant to protect the local population from the possible incursion of the nationalists from Euromaidan into Donbass. This was at least the fear. This phase ends at some time at about the end of March, because a lot of that initial protest potential fizzles out, and there is a sense that Russia is not going to intervene directly into Donbass the way it did in Crimea. So what I see is both a disillusionment among many of the local protesters, separatist, I guess, activists and leaders, but also a change in rhetoric of the local elites. So if initially these mayors of these towns were criticizing Euromaidan, were saying that we demanded more rights, etc., by the end of March, they became much more accepting of the new Ukrainian government and sent signals to the locals to basically demobilize. They were trying to pacify the locals, say that there is nothing to be fearful of, etc., etc. That leads to the second stage, and the second stage begins with the incursion of Girkin into Slavyansk on April 12th. So now we are at what is the 11th anniversary of that event. And that generates a different stage. That stage is a more direct attempt to remove the presence of the Ukrainian state through the use of force from Donbass and from these towns, right? And this is something that the locals have not been doing prior to the incursion of Girkin. That's how I think it really changed the nature of the confrontation, from being just a political nonviolent confrontation to a confrontation that is based on the use of force and direct challenge to the state authority. And once Girkin does that in Slavyansk, this tactic of the capture of the police station, the capture of the local city council, the proclamation of some type of a new local authorities, people's mayors, etc., all of that is replicated in multiple towns around Donbass in a matter of several weeks. And then you have also the declarations of independence or sovereignty of these two republics, Luhansk and Donetsk, by the people who captured buildings in Donetsk and Luhansk. And very quickly, there is this projection, there is this goal of a referendum that is announced to legitimize the separatist takeover of these regions. A referendum was organized to basically claim legitimacy for these new separatist authorities. And this happens in a very short period of time of about a month, in which Ukrainian authorities are struggling with responding, but they don't really know how to respond accurately. And so a lot of time is lost in this period of 1 month. And once this coercive takeover, this is what I call the state formation stage, once the separatist state formation stage ends with the referendum, we are moving into the state building phase, and that is the formation of institutions of the new self-proclaimed state entities like Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, and an attempt to govern these towns on behalf now of these two separatist republics. So this is the third stage that begins sometime in mid-May and then continues all the way through August, where you have the formation of the ministries of defense, of the security services of these republics, Ministry of Economy, new representatives of new authorities are formed, separatist authorities, symbols are being projected on the locals, the separatist symbols, new flags, emblems, etc., etc. And so that is the process of state building. And as I demonstrate, Russian actors played a role at both at the state formation stage and the state building stage. But the way they played the role, their significance varied at each of these stages.
Well, since you mentioned already the state authorities, the Ukrainian or Kiev government authorities, it seems like the Ukrainian state played somehow a dual role throughout this period. It was, I guess, seen as a threat by many in the region that you described, that you researched. It was also the force behind the anti-terrorist operation. But also, it was still the Ukrainian state. It was still the government in Kiev that provided payments and services. So how did local actors reconcile these two faces of the Ukrainian government at that point?
Yes, it's a very important question, because I think initially, at least, in this emotional stage of rejection of the Euromaidan authorities, many locals downplayed the significance of the state in their daily lives. And so many believed that we, Donbass, provide a lot of finances, a lot of industrial power to the Ukrainian state, and we will survive ourselves through our own economic resources. So we don't need Kiev. We don't need their support. But then, as things moved along by May, when the Ukrainian government started to respond to the separatist takeover and cut off financial assistance and transfers of money into the local budgets in specific towns that were captured by the separatists, that is when the locals start to realize that a lot of what they are taking for granted in their daily lives, like the ability to use public transportation, the ability to go to the hospitals, schools, salaries of all the public officials, all of that is actually paid by Kiev, and that Donetsk and Luhansk are not going to pay their salaries. And that is when both the separatists started to ask for greater cooperation of the local authorities in order to continue providing these services. And so we see that there was this dual dependency. On one hand, local authorities were fearful of the militants because they came with guns and made these demands. On the other hand, militants at some point by May and June realized that they depend on these local authorities to continue providing these public services. Because if there is a major disruption in the provision of public services, this will discredit the whole separatist project, right? And so this was a very awkward dance that the separatists and the local officials had to engage in. But as this recognition became clear, as people stopped receiving pensions, as people face difficulties continuing in their jobs, for example, in factories, and many factory directors were actually going to Kiev and asking for continued provision of financial transfers for their workers while their towns were captured by the militants. All of this realization demobilized many people. So you see that the rallies in support of the separatist authorities shrink in size by May, end of May, and especially by June. People realize that the costs of separatist governance are not only the risk to their life from a counter-terrorist operation that is conducted by the Ukrainian military, that is using force to stop this separatist authorities, but it also comes from the lack of the economic costs, from the lack of basic resources to continue their normal livelihood, right? And in this sense, I think in many towns there was a willingness to reconsider their initial decision to support separatist authorities, and this emotional response, I think, moved into a more rational recognition that ultimately, without the presence of the Ukrainian state, it will be very difficult to continue living or maintaining the same standard of living.
Right. So you emphasize the agency of people in Donbass and various actors in Donbass. And at some point, as you're looking also at the Russian involvement, you say that Moscow realized that in order to sustain political challenge to Kiev and Donbass, Russia needed an external push. Your word, external push. So Russia watches the developments, but its interference is limited. What the limited interference was, and what was the push? What was the moment, maybe a transition when Russian involvement grew more intense?
So the external push came into two forms. One form I already mentioned, and that is a more direct coercive attack on the Ukrainian state that was done by people who were skilled in this. Because as we know, Girkin has been engaged in this type of separatist activities from the early 1990s, from the times in Transnistria. And so he knew how to organize these irregular formations and locals into these militias. But another important element to this push was this provision of ideas about separatist governance. So you have a variety of different Russians who were also skilled either with the example of experience of Transnistria or in other regions. They were skilled in organizing these separatist institutions. And they were sent. They were sent to Donbass. They were sent to Luhansk to help the locals in organizing these new institutions of these separatist republics. And another aspect, I think, was also ideological. A lot of the arguments in favor of creation of independent republics were given by Russian ideologues or thinkers, people like Dugin and others who were encouraging the formation of these separatist republics by looking at the concepts of Eurasianism, by looking at the significance of Novorossiya, etc. These ideas, these historical myths that provide philosophical or ideological justification for the separation of these republics. And there was also a technical side to it, and we know a lot about the involvement of Kremlin insiders like Vladislav Surkov, for example, in the technical development of various documents that would create the legal basis for the separatist authorities. Somebody had to write these declarations of independence, which went on for pages and pages and pages. Somebody had to come up with the structure of these new governments. Somebody had to come up with various statutes for these new institutions, laws that were adopted by these new parliaments and legislatures. So this technical side of organizing these new states, that was, I think, to a large extent also done by some of the Kremlin insiders, like Vladislav Surkov, and people who represented him there, like Baradai, who was, as we know, the first prime minister of the Donetsk People's Republic. So these external pushes, they were happening both on the coercive side, provision of people skilled in violence, but also in political and ideological side as well.
Why was it that at some point the Russian president, the Kremlin, decided that this interference that you have just described is not enough? That it is time for something that is a military interference because apparently Russia was not achieving its goals. So from the prospect of how Russia saw its goals vis-a-vis Donbass, why at some point the Russian tactics or strategy changed and Russia switched from the kind of interference that you've just described to a more overt military interference.
So the interference switched only at the time when it became clear that the Ukrainians were on the verge of destroying these separatist republics and recapturing the two capitals of these republics, Donetsk and Luhansk. So remember, by mid-August, the Ukrainian forces basically encircled both of these capitals, and they managed to recapture most of the territory closer to the Russian border. And this was the crucial, because control over the Russian border by the militants that was established very early on allowed for a lot of shipments of arms and mercenaries across the border. The fact that Ukrainian border guards ultimately were many of them were killed. Many of them had to leave these areas. This enabled Russia to continue providing this covert support. Once the Ukrainian forces moved closer to the border and established control over most of it by mid-August, that is when Russia realized that if they wait for a few more weeks, the border will be closed totally. And then it's just a matter of time when Donetsk and Luhansk will fall, right? So the incursion that happened by the regular Russian troops in unidentified insignia was done primarily to restore the separatist control, the so-called separatist control over the border, and then move the Ukrainian troops outside of the suburbs of Donetsk and Luhansk, so that the front line or the line of contact moves away from these cities and the direct threat to these cities is removed. It's important to note that the Russian troops, as they moved, they did not move all the way to recapture those territories that were lost by the separatists. They didn't even move to recapture Mariupol, for example, even though they could have done that. And I cite the reports of the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, the so-called white paper that was prepared by the Ukrainian military, that suggested that had the Russians decided to move further into Donbass, into Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and even into other regions, they actually could have done that, because the Ukrainian troops at that time were very weak and many of them were non-existent. So many of these roads were not controlled by the Ukrainian forces. And as a result, the road was open and they could have marched all the way to other regions, to Dnipro, Kharkiv, etc., etc. So the threat was real, but the Russian strategy, as we saw at that time in 2014, was to minimize the involvement of these regular troops in the conflict and to maintain this impression or pretense that the entire conflict is ultimately fought by the local separatist fighters. And of course, when we know what happened in September of 2014, it's clear why they were doing it. Their expectation was that this will generate or start a negotiation process in which the local separatist authorities would receive a significant degree of autonomy and would then be ultimately reintegrated into the Ukrainian state on the new conditions. So the goal was, at that time, as I understand it, of Moscow, was not to annex or capture and control these territories directly, but to control them politically, indirectly, through these separatist authorities.
Yes, thank you for making it so clear. From this perspective and from the perspective of your research and the conclusions that you reached, how do you see the Minsk process? Was there ever a chance for compromise?
Well, Minsk agreements were a form of a compromise between the separatists, the Russians, and the Ukrainians, but primarily between between Putin and Poroshenko, first and foremost. The question was not the compromise possible? It was possible, but whether or not Minsk agreements could have been implemented. And here, I think my research in my book shows that I believe that on the terms that the Russia wanted to implement Minsk agreements, these agreements were not possible to implement. the way in which Russia wanted to implement the Minsk agreements would have meant that Russia would increase its political presence in the Ukrainian state to an extent that was far greater than it had prior to 2014. Because prior to 2014, they controlled the Ukrainian politics or influenced Ukrainian politics through political parties and individual actors like Party of Regions, Communist Party of Ukraine, their leaders, some businessmen, and oligarchs, etc. This is how they controlled the Ukrainian state or influenced policymaking. But these were not ideal proxies for them because oligarchs had their own businesses to take care of. They had their own business interests that oftentimes contradicted the interests of Moscow. Political parties like Party of Regions, as we saw, also had its own interests. And at some point, many of the actions and decisions that were taken by Yanukovych, for example, integration with the European Union. Remember, Yanukovych negotiated an agreement with the European Union that Yushchenko could not do. That contradicted the interests of Moscow. And so they were not ideal proxies, and Russia had very limited influence still over Ukraine. If Minsk agreements were implemented, people like Zakharchenko or Plotnitsky in Luhansk, Zakharchenko in Donetsk, and others, they would become much better proxies because they would be fully dependent on Moscow. They would be ideologically aligned with Moscow. And in that sense, if they had a certain veto power over foreign policy choices of Ukraine, or ability to disrupt the process of state building and nation building in Ukraine, they certainly could have done that very successfully and much more successfully than Party of Regions. And that was unacceptable from the standpoint of Ukraine, of Kiev, and it's understandable why it was not possible to accept these conditions. So the compromise was reached, but it was a temporary compromise, as we understand. It was a short-term compromise driven by the realization of Poroshenko that Ukraine faced a much worse outcome if that compromise is not reached. That the Russians had a greater advantage on the battlefield had they deployed regular troops at that time, and that Ukraine did not have enough capacity to stop them. So in that sense, I don't criticize Poroshenko for reaching the Minsk agreements, but I also understand why it was so difficult ultimately to implement them according to the provisions that were as they were read by the Russians.
Before we conclude, I would ask you to say a few words about two major cities where you also did your research. In addition to Donbass, apparently you worked also in Odessa and Kharkiv. Would you maybe briefly say how those two places were different, were essentially different from Donbass?
Right. So the chapter, one of the concluding chapters in my book deals specifically with Odessa and Kharkiv. And I did research there, and I talked to both those who supported the pro-Ukrainian side in these towns and also those who supported the pro-Russian side. And my main conclusion is the following. There were many elite actors who played different roles on the ground, but I think the decisive factor was this notion that the region itself, even though the city, for example, the Kharkiv or Odessa, under certain circumstances could have fallen into the hands of the separatists. And I think in the case of Kharkiv, it was more likely than in the case of Odessa. But the control over the city does not give much as far as the separatist state building is concerned. Because as we saw in the case of Donbass, the model was not just to establish control over the capital city. The model, the goal for Moscow was to create these separatist republics, larger scale entities that would then negotiate with Kiev directly. That is something that was not possible in Odessa and Kharkiv because of the structures of these regions. They were much more diverse ethnically, culturally. There are significant minorities, for example, in Odessa, the Bulgarian minority, the Moldovan minority. Kharkiv Oblast is basically divided into two parts, and it always voted differently, these two parts. Donbass was much more of a single political unit. 90% of the residents of Donbass consistently voted for Yanukovych in presidential elections. These regions were much more divided outside of the cities. And hence, in addition to that, of course, there were no large major cities that were possible where you could possibly mobilize separatist support in the way that it was done in Donbass. where you have this dense agglomeration, urban agglomerations, and protests against Kiev happened in multiple towns simultaneously. This was not the case in these regions. So my ultimate conclusion was, because of these structural differences and inability to capture entire regions, Moscow very early on decided and realized that they should not be investing their resources in trying to build separatist republics in this region, and that all the resources have to be channeled in the formation of the separatist republics in Donbass.
Yeah, for my final question, I picked a quote from your book, which says, ironically, what made the local response to the Russian invasion, in this case, you mean the invasion 3 years ago, which made their response to the Russian invasion so different were the institutional and societal changes triggered by Russia's early intervention in 2014. And to conclude our conversation, I would like you to deliberate on that.
Right. So this was an unintentional outcome, I think, because obviously the Russian intervention was not meant to provoke an anti-Russian backlash within Ukraine. And I think the expectation early on was that these regions that Putin identified as Novorossiya, southeastern Ukraine, would remain very much sympathetic to Russia, even despite everything they've done in Ukraine, annexation of Crimea and Donbass. But as we've seen from multiple surveys and research of many of my colleagues, including Gerard Toal has done a lot of work on that, there was a clear diversion in these regions away from the pro-Russian narratives. And the longer over time, these regions became much more accepting of the Ukrainian narratives, of the national Ukrainian identity, were willing to switch to the Ukrainian language in larger numbers, and were much more aware of the threat that Russia poses. And that is very clear in the level of support, for example, for NATO integration. The level of support for NATO integration, membership into NATO, actually went up after 2014. And when Putin complained that Ukraine may be becoming member of NATO, it was partially or largely because of his actions, that so many Ukrainians suddenly embraced NATO as the savior, as a possible savior for Ukraine. And so these nation-building policies that were conducted by the Ukrainian authorities were proved to be much more successful. And we saw in 2022 that a lot of resistance to the Russian invasion happened from the locals on the ground in southern Ukraine. And the fact that Mykolaiv, for example, did not fall and was not captured by the Russian forces in the way Kherson was, ultimately could be attributed to the local resistance that was very intense and was very strong in the very early months of the Russian full-scale invasion.
Serhiy, thank you for talking to me today, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you, Maria. It was a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you.